Hello and welcome to this video tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to sew the Peter pants and the Udo shorts. This is a combined video tutorial because the sewing steps are identical. The only difference is basically the length of the leg. Both patterns have been on the market since 2022 but have been updated in March 2025. The pattern pieces itself and also the construction and the sewing steps have changed. So if you've purchased the pattern before March 2025 and you want to have the update, please read the info box. There you can find all information how to get the updated version. The patterns are available as shorts, Udo only, palazzo pants, Peter only, and also there is a bundle. If you purchase the bundle, there will be both patterns on one pattern sheet. You can choose between high waist and a mid waist option. The mid waist option is new. Before there was only high waist, but since the update in March 2025, you can also sew the pants or shorts with a mid waist. Also, you can sew Peter or Udo with or without pockets. Before, the pocket bag was part of the front piece and now it's an extra piece that allows you to omit the pockets easier, and it's also easier to adjust the pattern to your body measurements now. There is also an optional drawstring in the waistband. If you want, you can leave that out too. In that case, you don't need to install buttonholes or eyelets. Also, for the Peter pants, you can decide between two different leg width. Basically, one is slim and the other one is wide. Well, the slim one is basically also wide. The wide one is just around 16 centimeters wider in its circumference. In the beginning of the tutorial, I'm showing different versions. There you can see how slim the slim leg is and how wide the wide leg is. For the Peter pants, there are now 3 different leg lengths pre-drawn in the pattern. Depending on how tall you are, you can choose between 160, 168 and 176, so that you don't have to adjust the leg length by yourself. Of course, everybody is different and you might still have to shorten or lengthen depending on how long your legs are, but I think the majority will fit. To figure out your size, please measure your waist and also your hip measurement and compare it to the body measurement chart. There you can see in what size bracket you fall. If you fall into different sizes, for example, your waist is size D, but your hips is size F, then you can adjust the pattern to your body. This is explained in the written instructions under modifications. Also, it is very important to measure your hip at the widest part of your bottom. I will show it. It is very common that the widest part of your hip is not here, but way lower around here. As you can see on my body, this is the widest part. So always make sure to measure the circumference of the widest part of your hip, no matter how low this might be. If I would measure, for example, at this height, instead of this, I would measure 1 to 2 sizes smaller than I would actually need, and the pants would turn out too small. The fit of the pants is loose, while the shorts is a bit wider at the hips than the Peter pants. Basically, it looks better if the Peter pants is a bit slimmer around the hips, especially if you're using a fabric which is not extremely lightweight and flowy. Regarding the difficulty, I would say it is very suitable for beginners because you don't need an overlocker, there are no difficult sewing steps, and the suitable fabrics are quite easy to work with, especially if you're using a cotton poplin, for example. If you omit the pockets and also the drawstring, it will be even easier. If you're a beginner, always make sure that you are sewing a mirrored pair of pants legs and not a parallel one. This is a very common mistake, especially if you're using a fabric with 2 sides that look alike. But I'm showing you in the cutting section how to mark your pattern pieces to always see which is the right and which is the wrong side. To make these pants, you will need fabric. I will go into detail in a bit. Also elastic, which is 4 centimeters wide. Basically you will need the circumference of your waist plus around 5 to 10 centimeters to be on the safe side. Then you will need some interfacing if you are sewing it with pockets, and also some interfacing if you are going to install buttonholes or eyelets to reinforce these areas. I would recommend H200. And then you will need 2 eyelets, so these are also optional. You can also install buttonholes or nothing at all. Fabric recommendations depend on what you're going to sew. For the Peter pants, I would recommend lightweight and flowy fabrics such as viscose, cotton knits, double gauze, linen, viscose blends, satin or tencel fabrics. Those are very lightweight and flowy. And it will look really beautiful with this pattern. You can also use cotton poplin, but it has a little bit more sturdiness than the other fabrics, and the drape won't be as beautiful, but it is still possible. I would not recommend using any heavy or sturdy fabrics such as corduroy or denim, for example. These fabrics are unsuitable for such wide-legged pants with elasticated waist. For the shorts, the recommendation is a bit different. For the shorts, you can also use sturdier fabrics and it will look pretty good. I would recommend linen, cotton poplin, double gauze, French terry, cotton knits, but also lightweight or flowy fabrics such as viscose, tencel, or satin. If you're going to use double gauze, I'm often being asked whether or not to pre-press it. I would always recommend to press it before you cut out your double gauze, because it is likely to shrink during your wash, and if you cut it out and then you wear it, then it's basically wearing out a lot and it will turn out much larger than intended. In order to keep a good fit and the intended fit, I recommend to pre-press it before you cut it out. Let's start with the cutting. As always, here is an overview with all the pattern pieces that you will need. You will need these pieces for the Peter pants with pockets. These pieces you will need for the Peter pants without pockets. If you're going to sew the Udo shorts with pockets, these are the pattern pieces that you will need, and these are the ones that you will need for the Udo shorts without pockets. The drawstring is also optional, so basically you can just leave it out, and in that case you also don't need any buttonholes or eyelets on the waistband. If you're sewing Peter or Udo without pockets, you can simply cut as pointed by my finger, and if you cut it with pocket, just fold away that little triangle at the top of your front piece. The slanted edge that is being created here is the pocket opening. I also want to share a little tip how to cut out the drawstring easily. It's a very long and thin pattern piece, and cutting it out is quite fumbly, and this way it's becoming way easier. Just fold and press your fabric 3 to 4 centimeters to the right fabric side so that right fabric sides are facing. You don't necessarily have to consider the grain line, any edge is possible. The finished drawstring needs to be twice the length of your drawstring pattern piece. If you don't have an edge which is long enough, you can basically just cut it out twice and connect it on the short sides. Then draw a line 2 centimeters parallel from your folded edge and cut it out. And last but not least, I'm going to add 2 markings that are approximately 3 to 4 centimeters apart right at the center, and I'm cutting into the open side and not into the fold. Through this gap we're going to turn the drawstring right side out later. As always, I'm transferring all the markings to the fabric with a little clip or with tailor's chalk, and I also mark the center of my waistband right at the fold with 2 little clips. This is the marking for the center front later. Transfer the position of your buttonholes or eyelets in case you're going to sew them to your waistband to the right fabric side. I basically push 2 pins through the ends of the marking and then simply connect it. If your fabric looks the same from the right and wrong side like mine, it is really important to mark the right fabric side with 2 pins as I'm doing here. First place both back pieces, right fabric side facing up, and then put 2 pins into it. Make sure that the back pieces are mirrored, and then repeat these steps with your front pieces and also your pocket pieces. Always make sure that you are placing them mirrored and not parallel. And next we're going to reinforce the pocket opening. Basically press a little strip of interfacing. I'm using H200 here to the wrong fabric side, right to the pocket opening, approximately half a centimeter away from the edge. And then also press interfacing to the wrong fabric side of your waistband, right at the position of the markings for your eyelets or buttonholes. Next we're going to sew the pockets. If you're sewing your pants without pockets, simply jump into the next chapter. Grab both front pieces and both upper pocket pieces. The upper pocket pieces are the ones that are a little bit smaller and they also have that slanted edge. And then place them right sides facing onto the front pieces and pin them together along the pocket opening right until the marking. Now we're going to stitch from the top right until the marking using a regular straight stitch. And here as an exception, we are stitching with 0.7 centimeters of seam allowance. Basically we are stitching with less than our usual seam allowance of 1 centimeter. This is what it should look like, and here is our marking, and I will clip right into the marking right until the end of my seam. I will stop approximately 1 to 2 millimeters before the end of my seam. Next I'm going to unfold the pocket and press the seam flat. Basically I'm pressing the seam allowances towards the pocket. Next we're going to top stitch. Basically we are stitching the seam allowance down right at the pocket with a little distance of 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam, and we will stop right at the marking. Basically we are only stitching as far as our previous seam. This is what it will look like, and now we're going to fold the pocket along the pocket opening to the wrong fabric side of the front piece. Then you can pull out the seam allowances at the side, so there will be this little corner, and then make sure everything is laying flush at the top and also the sides. Pin the pocket and the front piece in place, and at the pocket opening make sure that the seam is laying 2 to 3 millimeters further inside, so the seam won't be visible from the outside later. Now take the lower pocket piece and place it on top of your upper pocket piece so that the curves are laying flush. Also make sure that the right fabric side of your lower pocket piece, the one where we've inserted the pins as markings, are facing towards the front piece. Now it's time to stitch. We are stitching together both pocket pieces along the curve with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, a regular straight stitch, and then I will finish the seam with my overlocker, but you can also use a large zigzag stitch instead. Make sure that you are stitching together only 2 layers of fabric. This is what it should look like now on the inside, and this is what it will look like now from the outside. You now have a pocket, and now make sure everything is laying nice and flat, and pin all 3 fabric layers along the side and top edge together so everything is laying nice and flush, and secure it with few pins. And now we're going to stitch it in place within the seam allowance. So basically half a centimeter away from the edge, so the pocket cannot shift anymore. Now press everything nice and flat, and once you've sewn up both pockets, you will have a mirrored pair of 2 front pieces with pockets. Next we're going to sew the side seam, and therefore grab one front piece and place it with right sides facing onto your back piece. Make sure that the sides with the pins are facing each other, and then just pin it together from top to bottom. Repeat this step with the other piece too, so you can check if you have a mirrored pair. This is what it will look like now. You now have a mirrored pair. And this is what it would look like if you're sewing pants Peter with the long legs. In both cases, the front piece will be way slimmer than the back piece, which is normal. Next, we're stitching along the sides with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance. And then I will finish the seam allowance with my overlocker, but as always, you can finish it with a big zigzag stitch instead. This is what it will look like, and now I'm going to unfold both pieces again so I can press the side seam nice and flat, and basically I'm pressing the seam allowance towards the back piece. Now pin the inseams together, right fabric sides facing. This is what it will look like in case you're sewing the Peter pants. I basically also just pinned the inseams together, right fabric sides facing. And now we're going to sew the inseams with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance, and then I will finish the seams. Now in order to sew the crotch seam, turn one of the 2 pants legs right fabric side out, while the other one remains wrong fabric side out. We are now going to sew the crotch seam, which is basically the one that goes from your belly button until your center back, and therefore open up the one which is not turned right side out and stuff the one that you have turned right side out into it, so that right fabric side of both pant legs are facing and both front pieces are together. And now pin both pieces together along the crotch seam and match up the inseams. We are basically pinning together only 2 layers of fabric. This is what it will look like, and now it's time to stitch with a regular straight stitch, as always a 1 cm seam allowance, and then I will finish the seam. This is what it will look like now, and if you now pull out one leg, it already starts to look like a pair of pants. And next we're going to continue with the waistband, and the first step is to install buttonholes or the eyelets. You will only need those in case you want to insert a drawstring into the waistband, and I'm sewing up buttonholes. My sewing machine has a special function for it. I would recommend to check the instructions of your sewing machine to check how buttonholes work on your sewing machine. And next I'm going to finish both short edges of my waistband with my overlocker, but you can also do it with a large zigzag stitch as always. Here you can see the buttonholes and the finished edges. And now fold it so that right fabric sides are facing. The buttonholes or eyelets should be on the inside, and then pin it together along the short sides. Here are 2 markings, and we will leave a little gap right between those markings so that we can insert the elastic through that gap later. Basically, I'm sewing right until the first marking, then I will backstitch, and then I will continue sewing at the second marking. As always, I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance. Now fold the whole waistband lengthwise so that wrong fabric sides are facing. I always open up the seam allowances, and then I will secure it with a few pins all the way around. Basically, both open edges are aligning. Next, we're going to pin the waistband to the pants. On the waistband there are the eyelets or the buttonholes, and also there is the marking of the center front, which will meet the center front crotch seam, and I'm going to pin it to my pants so that the eyelets or buttonholes are facing downwards towards the pants. And also the seam of the waistband will meet the center back, and here it is important that the little gap that we have left on the waistband is facing upwards away from the pants, and then you can just pin the waistband to your pants all the way around so that all 3 open edges are laying flush together. We are here basically pinning 3 layers of fabric together. And now it's time to stitch. I'm sewing all the way around with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance, and as always after that I will finish my seam. This is what it will look like, and now if you fold the waistband up, you will see that the eyelets or buttonholes are facing outside and the hole in the waistband is on the inside. Now we're going to cut the elastic to size. It should be 4 cm wide, and if you're sewing the high-waisted pants, just wrap it around your waist and add 1 centimeter of seam allowance. It should be comfortable but not too loose and not too tight. And if you're sewing the mid-waist pants, wrap it around your body right under your belly button. It should be lower than your waist, and then find the perfect length for you and cut it to size with a 1 centimeter of extra seam allowance. You can always shorten it later, so if you're insecure, just cut it with a little bit more seam allowance to be on the safe side, and then it's being pulled into the waistband with a safety pin through the gap that we have left in the waistband, and then just overlap the ends by 1 centimeter and sew them together with a zigzag stitch. Make sure that the elastic is not twisted inside the waistband. You can now try on the pants and check whether you like the length. For the shorts, there are 2 centimeters of hem allowance included, and at the palazzo pants there are 3 centimeters of hem allowance included. You can now shorten it if you want, and if you're happy with the length, we're going to finish the hem all the way around. I'm using my overlocker here, but you can also use a larger zigzag stitch instead, as always, and then just fold the hem to the inside all the way around, 2 centimeters at the shorts and 3 centimeters at the palazzo pants. The shorts hem is a bit curved, so it might be a little bit more tricky, but you can still do it. And if it's not 100% perfect, don't worry, no one will notice it later, especially if you're pressing your hem. And then it's time to stitch. I'm sewing all the way around with a regular straight stitch, and when I'm hemming my shorts, I'm sewing with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and when I'm hemming my palazzo pants, I'm using a 2.5 centimeter seam allowance. And last but not least, we are pressing the hem nice and flat. Next, we're going to sew the drawstring. If you've cut it as shown in the beginning of the video, it's already folded lengthwise with right fabric sides facing. You can directly stitch without pinning it, but if you haven't pressed it or cut it as shown in the beginning of the video, you will have to pin it lengthwise so that right fabric sides are facing. And then we are sewing as shown with the red line here, with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and we are leaving a little turning gap right at the center of the drawstring, basically right between the 2 markings. I prefer to sew the drawstring with a regular straight stitch and a quite short stitching length. Basically I'm stitching with 2 or 2.3 to make sure that it won't tear when I'm trying to turn it later, and especially at the short sides of the drawstring I will backstitch quite a lot to make sure the seam is durable and won't break. Here is the turning gap that we have left, and now I'm going to trim back the seam allowances to 3 millimeters along the seam. It will make it easier to turn it, and I'm leaving the whole seam allowance of 1 centimeter along the turning gap. And now it's time to turn it. I'm using my Prüm turning tool. I'm turning each side by itself through the turning gap. I will link the tool that I'm using below because I find it quite helpful. It is still always a bit fiddly, but with this tool I think it's quite okay. I will now close the turning gap by top stitching it close to the edge, and then I will give it a good press to make it nice and flat again. Now cut the buttonholes open if you haven't done it already, and then grab a large safety pin, attach it to your drawstring and pull it through your eyelets or buttonholes to insert it into the waistband. Now I'm going to secure the elastic right at the center front to prevent it from twisting. If you're sewing the pants with a drawstring, I would recommend to do that in the center front so that you don't interfere with the drawstring. But if you're sewing without a drawstring, I would recommend to secure the elastic at the side or at the center back so that it is not as visible as in the center front. Always use a thread color which is the same as your pants.